now that vote economic development stand part of the schedule? Honourable David Parker.
Thank you for the call, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, I would like the Minister and the Chair to respond to the reality that the government's own budget shows that the underlying structural problems in the New Zealand economy remain unresolved, and this is shown by the projections on page 70 of the Minister's executive summary, if the Minister wants to look at the documents while he takes the time to respond, showing that New Zealand's current account deficit gets worse every year from here. Now, we've just been through a recession in New Zealand, as in other parts of the world, and that's not all the government's fault. But during that period of recession, New Zealand's current account deficit did reduce. That's because economic activity went down and people were buying less consumption goods, fewer purchases were made, and as a consequence there were fewer imports, and therefore the current account deficit went down. This year the current account deficit has been recalculated recently by the Department of Statistics. At one stage it had wrongly included the reinsurance proceeds from Christchurch as being a current account payment rather than a capital payment, but stripped out, the current account deficit is now on the rise again. The projections in the budget show that the current account deficit next year goes to 4.1% negative of GDP, then 5.2% of GDP in 2013, then 6.8% 2014, and then negative 6.9% in 2015, so that by then the current account deficit as a percentage of GDP will have gone up every year for 5 years, for the last 5 years to 2015 if this government is re-elected. In other words, during that period, more than $10 billion per annum extra in the current account deficit is added. And that's effectively funded. Well, how much, Stevie Chadwick asked, the amount is over $52 billion extra that effectively has to be funded by New Zealand borrowing money overseas. So New Zealand's net investment position in the world over that period goes backwards every year. So under the government's prescription, if it's re-elected, according to its own projections, come 2015, New Zealand gets poorer, and that's after the previous year when it's got poorer, and the previous year it gets poorer. So after 6 years, according to their prescription, New Zealand gets poorer every year. And that is why the Treasury has said to the government that New Zealand has structural economic problems, and that's one of the reasons why New Zealand needs structural change in our economy, caused by the government pulling the levers that it can pull to change the direction of our economy. Now, what are those levers? Well, the problem for the national government is they've ruled virtually all of them out. They've reduced savings through KiwiSaver, through their constant tinkering with it and through changing the generosity of the scheme. So they're not going to get a marked improvement in New Zealand's savings as a consequence of that particular change. They've ruled out a land tax to try and change investment patterns in New Zealand, and now they've ruled out a capital gains tax as being appropriate. Now, Mr. Speaker, this starts to look a bit like the Rudd government in Australia that was so rudderless they were eventually penalised at the last election and only just squeaked in for a second term. They look a bit like the Americans who can't do what's so obviously necessary in America, which is to change their tax system to cure some of their problems. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, you don't have to take my word for this. I want to quote a couple of the third-party economists. We've had the BNZ recently saying that New Zealand's got an investment problem because the investment signal is wrong, because of the tax bias in favour of speculative investment. We had Westpac Chief Economist Dominic Stevens saying New Zealanders are incentivised to borrow money to buy land rather than invest in productive assets. If we introduced a capital gains tax, that incentive would be diminished and there would be a greater incentive for people to save via bank deposits or productive business ownership. Mr. Chairman, what the Westpac economist is noting that if you get the investment signal right, then some of that money that's currently over-invested in speculative sector would go into the productive sector, and that would grow jobs, it would grow well-paid jobs for New Zealand, and it would create, Mr Chairman, it would create more jobs for New Zealand, and New Zealand would begin to turn around the ship. This is a problem that has gone on for 2 decades in New Zealand. Our current mix of savings, tax and monetary policy has seen New Zealand get poorer essentially continuously for more than 20 years now, and unless there is structural change, that pattern will continue, as the government's own budget projections show. It's not just Westpac economists saying that. We've had Gareth Morgan saying the current exclusion of capital gains tax is, and I quote, the biggest tax wrought in the country, and one that has cost us dearly in terms of efficient allocation of capital, economic growth and employment. Again, another reputable economist saying that the current settings that the government refuses to change, that have led to this blowing out of the current account deficit going forward, costs us dearly in terms of the allocation of capital, which suppresses economic growth and also means that we've got higher unemployment and indeed worse paying jobs than we would otherwise have. It's not just the economists. Virtually all of the commentators in the media are saying the same thing. The Dominion, there is a gaping hole in the tax system. Different sources of income are taxed differently. Earn $50,000 by working 40 hours a week and you'll be taxed at the going rate for income. Make a $50,000 profit on the sale of a rental property and you'll not be taxed at all. We've had Mike Hosking saying, we quote, we've for years in this country placed an absurd advantage on owning property. And given it's free of tax, you wonder why we've become so reliant on housing and why the economy has been so tipped towards real estate. That's the question he poses. Rhetorical question. We already know the answer. We've had Anthony Hubbard saying capital gains taxes are perfectly ordinary taxes used by most developed countries. They're not a recipe for instant economic ruin. Otherwise, these wealthy countries would be poor. A capital gains tax does not mean everyday Kiwis could be crushed. Capital gains tax should not lead to panic in an election. There's nothing to panic about. Well, the National Party, of course, is panicking about this because they know they are on the wrong side of this debate. Mr. Speaker, we have bad news internationally at the moment, and the government will be saying, oh, poor they are, oh, woe we are, because we're having to deal with these circumstances. The reality is that New Zealand's circumstance is parlous because our net investment position in the world gets worse every year. Yes, the government deficit is a problem, made worse by the government's unaffordable tax cuts so weighted to the highest income earners. But the greater problem is our current account deficit. Our greater problem is our current account deficit growing ever larger, leading to New Zealanders getting poorer every year. And it's the lack of a plan from the government to address that which stands out. New Zealanders and commentators are increasingly saying this. The government has not pulled any of the structural levers at its disposal. Last week it says our monetary policy is perfect, we don't need to change it. It says that it's got it right on savings, despite the fact that they ignored the Savings Working Group recommendations, and savings through KiwiSaver are going to decline, or the rate of increase is going to be lower than it would otherwise be. And they won't pull any of the tax levers. So they won't touch monetary policy, they won't touch savings, they won't touch the tax mix. They call our tax switch tax and spend. For them a tax switch is just a tax switch, but for us somehow changing taxes to have a capital gains tax to fund a tax-free zone and GST off fresh fruit and vegetables and an R&D tax credit, somehow that's not a tax switch, that's tax and spend. This government has no credibility on these issues. That message is getting through. They said this would put a dagger through the heart of the economy. They have been shown to be wrong. They thought it would be a suicide pill for the Labour Party. It has not proved to be the case. It has not proved to be the case because we, under Phil Goff, are brave enough to take these important decisions that need to be taken for our country. Mr. Chairman, the government own figures show that their plan for the economy, scant though it is not working. Structural changes are needed in order to make the structural changes to the economy to grow our export base. I know the Minister and the Chair thinks that agriculture is virtually the only game in town, but we are not going to get richer as a country relying upon agriculture alone. That's why the Manufacturers and Exporters Association, that's why the Productive Economy Council are both in support of the proposed tax changes that we have, because they know that that is right to get the investment signal, to get some of that money that's currently going to the wrong place into productive enterprise.
Honourable Shane Jones.